This week on Mutuality Matters.
So
Mm.
to me, purity culture is not just the belief in abstinence before marriage or what you're saying of purity, but it's the shame and fear that is
Mm.
used to coerce and control and manipulate the choice. It's not really a choice, you know?
Mm.
Um, Instead of giving people a more holistic and broader theology of sexuality and then empowering and allowing them to make their own choices based on their theology and their sexual ethic.
Thanks for joining us this week, and welcome to Mutuality Matters, a podcast hosted by CBE International. Let's get into this week's episode.
Hello and welcome to the Mutuality Matters podcast. My name is Todd Korpi,
And I am Tara Korpi.
and you have joined us for the segment where we focus on headship, what it means for the church, what it means for society, and what it means for the home. And we are absolutely delighted to have with us Dr. Camden Morgante today to talk about her new book, which I have right here, Recovering from Purity Culture. And Camden, we're so excited to be able to, first of all, to be able to read your book, but then to be able to discuss this topic, because I think it's one that for any of us who grew up in the church, who are a part of the church even now,
Mhm.
is a misunderstood topic, but
Mm.
one where I think that your unique voice adds so much value to the conversation. So welcome to
Mm.
Mutuality
Mm.
Matters.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be in good company with other egalitarians. So, yeah, very excited to talk to you all.
Yeah, very
Yes,
much
thank you
so.
so much.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
hmm Yeah, I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm a licensed psychologist, so I have a therapy practice here where I work exclusively with women and married couples on issues of sexuality, faith, relationships, and trauma. And then I also coach online, and that's specifically for purity culture recovery and faith reconstruction, deconstruction, because I wanted to be able to reach people just outside of my state as a therapist. And then I write and speak and have done that over the last few years, and all of that has culminated into this book finally coming out into the world. So it's been a passion of mine for many years that I've been working on, and yeah, I'm just relieved it's out there now.
Yeah.
Well, it's an exceptionally well written book, obviously
Oh,
well
thank you.
researched. But I think that, for both of us who grew up in kind of, we're both elder millennials, so 1990s, early 2000s evangelicalism,
Mhm.
there's many ways in which it was describing our youth,
Yeah.
So I would love to hear, if you don't mind, just kind of describe a little bit what led you to write this book, and how have both your personal and professional experiences influenced
Mhm.
the you coming to this topic?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was a big proponent of purity culture as I grew up, and really bought into it. I had a True Love Waits ring that I wore for almost a decade, a very,
Did it
yeah,
did it come
very
with a ceremony?
long time.
Did you have a
I signed a pledge card. I
there you
guess
go.
kind of did
Okay.
that on my own. I didn't have like
Okay.
a formal like ceremony or like public pledge or anything, but yeah, really loved it. Read all the purity books, most of them in my teenage years, and went to a Christian college, and that was part of the culture there too. And yeah, so I was really a big proponent of it. And then I found that many of like the myths of purity culture, as I now call them, just didn't turn out for me. Like they turned out to be false promises. I did not find and meet and marry my first love at a young age like I was told I was going to. I was told like as long as you do all the right things, save yourself for marriage and follow the rules, like you won't get your heart broken, you'll probably marry your first love right out of college, and that's really what I expected for my trajectory. And when that didn't happen, when I was in a my serious relationship, long-term relationship ended, and I was heartbroken from that, but also my faith ended up being really devastated from it because it was kind of built on these false promises of purity culture.
Mm.
So I went through a period of faith and reconstruction in my 20s of figuring out, is God, good? And, is he powerful and all loving? Like just trying to make sense of suffering and pain and unmet longings in my life, and becoming a therapist and seeing a lot of trauma in my clients that I had not experienced. Um and then I got married, met my husband, got married when we were about 30. And it was then that I started to really realize like the struggles I went through was because of purity culture. There's a name for it now. People were starting to speak up about it. Linda K. Klein's book Pure came out. Like that was kind of the first groundbreaking expose. And Yeah, and I realized this is harming my clients too, because I'm seeing at the time I was working at a college, as in the counseling center, and then as a professor at the college, a Christian college, and seeing my students just really unprepared for marriage. And I was glad that I had the benefit of some extra years and the training as a psychologist when I got married. And yeah, and so I thought my professional and personal journeys really intersected there of like I want to share not only my own personal story of being harmed by purity culture and then healing from it, but also these tools that I've learned as a psychologist that are really helpful for healing and what I know about mind body integration and trauma and things like that. And I also felt like I had a different perspective to provide in the book as a Christian, as
Mm.
someone who still identifies as a Christian and still has a lot of value, like values the sacredness of sex and marriage. I wanted to provide that perspective because I just didn't see it in a lot of the other books that were being written. Yeah, so that was part of my journey too that led to this book.
Yeah. Well, it's such an important book. And I mean, even for us, we have 3 children that are girls. And, with both of us being raised in purity culture, we're like, we don't want to perpetuate some of the dysfunctions that were given to us. But what does
Yeah.
it mean to raise our family with purity in mind? And a lot of
Mhm.
people, mistakenly believe that purity culture is purity itself. And, to critique purity culture means that you're against sexual purity. So can you help
Mhm.
our listeners kind of understand the difference between the purity culture that we're speaking of and sexual purity?
Mhm. Yeah, this all comes back to what your definition of purity culture is. And my definition in the book is that it was the myths, messages, and cultural movement that peaked in the 1990s to 2000s, largely in evangelicalism,
Hmm.
that attempted to persuade young people to avoid sex before marriage, using shame and fear as tools of control. So, to me, purity culture is not just the belief in abstinence before marriage or what you're saying of purity, but it's the shame and fear that is
Mm-hmm.
used to coerce and control and manipulate the choice. It's not really a choice. Instead of giving people a more holistic and broader theology of sexuality and then empowering and allowing them to make their own choices based on their theology and their sexual ethic.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I distinguish with that in the book. I'm honest in the book about I still believe in a traditional sexual ethic of sex within a covenantal marriage, and I know not all of my readers or all of our listeners may land there as well. And I create space for that in the book because I didn't want to be prescriptive of this is what everybody has to believe and everybody has to do this. Like that's just not the purpose of my book. My purpose is really to help people with tools for healing and to
Mm-hmm.
see that you can have both your faith and healing. You don't have to choose either or because
Yeah.
a lot of, like I said, a lot of the purity culture books are written by people who've left the faith or people who no longer have traditional sexual values. And so I wanted to show that you can have both and you don't have to choose between healing and your faith.
Yeah. It's so
That's
good.
that's
Yeah.
yeah, that's really good. And it kind of creates a distinction between the sexual theology itself and the application of that theology. So one is a theological question, one is a spiritual formation question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's very true that it's not, I can think back about, our upbringing. It was about, if you do this, all hope is lost. And
Mm.
I remember I was in high school in our 6:30 a.m. Bible study that happened every week. And they brought in a guest speaker who talked about how, every time basically you touched a member of the opposite sex, you were giving
Oh
away
gosh.
a pearl
A
on this pearl
pearl.
necklace that Jesus
Okay.
gave you, and
Hmm.
which is what you give to your spouse. And
Mm.
so it created this like if I hold hands with a member of the
Mm.
opposite sex or pat them on the back, I've given away a pearl,
And the shame associated
Yeah.
with it. There's shame,
Mhm.
associated with that. And then you carry that into your marriage if you don't find healing from it.
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah.
I think
Mhm.
for our listeners, recognizing that, that may have been normative
Mhm.
during that time period. But when we look at the whole span of Christian history, that is not the normal or even biblical approach to spiritual formation.
Mhm.
The church fathers really emphasized the development of virtue and the
Mm.
mitigation of vices. So it's
Mhm.
kind of training our loves, training our appetites,
Mhm.
not applying, kind of metaphors and
Yeah.
whatnot to
Yeah.
coerce our behavior.
Yeah, that's
So
helpful. And I think, Tara, what you were saying earlier about, distinguishing purity culture and purity. I rarely use the term purity just because the negative connotations with it, but chastity, I think, is a Christian virtue that we're all called to. And to me, the virtue of chastity involves premarital abstinence and then faithfulness in marriage. And that is the way that I practice chastity and live out that virtue in my life. But your faith as a whole is so much bigger than just your sexuality and what you do with your sexuality. And purity culture really built the whole foundation of my faith on virginity. There's this narrow concept of your spiritual maturity is your virginity. And so that gave me a very immature, I think, spiritual formation experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
So within the book, you outlined 5 myths of purity culture. You already even made reference to them, and I'll just list them here: the spiritual barometer myth, the fairy tale myth, the flipped switch myth, the gatekeepers myth, and the damaged goods myth. If you can, take a moment and kind of just briefly define each of those and highlight which one that you maybe think is the most damaging or has the most damaging effect on individuals and their long-term ability to flourish in a relationship.
Yeah, so these myths came from me reviewing the books that I read as a teenager and the main messages that I heard, and I put them all in an article that I wrote for CBE in 2019 called 5 Purity Culture Myths and Why They Are False Promises. So the spiritual barometer myth is kind of what I was just describing, this idea that our spirituality is measured by our virginity, and especially for women, that your virtue and potential as a marriage partner is very tied to your virginity. And so the effects of that, I think, can be pride and judgmentalism for those who do remain virgins. And there's a difference between I'm proud of the choices that I've made and I feel content and I feel like I have lived according to my values, like a healthy pride, and this, what I call like an ugly or sinful pride of I'm a better Christian than you, and judging you for that and feeling the self-righteousness. So that's that myth. The fairy tale myth, the idea that you'll get your fairy tale marriage and spouse if you wait. And that's the one that affected me the most, leading to a sense of entitlement. Like, I'm entitled to this from God, and this kind of transactional relationship with God of, because I did X, God should give me Y. And it also led to a lot of disillusionment when that didn't happen. The flipped switch myth is very recognizable, that you just flip a switch when you get married and sex is instantly going to be pleasurable and easy and rewarding when it wasn't beforehand, when it was off limits before you were married. And I see that leading to a lot of disappointment in my couples. The people who did wait and maybe didn't even kiss until they got married, and sex has been frustrating and disappointing for 20 years of marriage rather than pleasurable and amazing. So that's the flip switch myth. The gatekeepers myth is the idea that women are the gatekeepers of sexuality, responsible for putting the brakes on before marriage and setting boundaries, and then after marriage, always being sexually available to meet their husband's sexual needs. And that leads to a lot of inequality. I think that's the one that us as egalitarians can speak out against the most, of that sex should be mutual and not unequal. It's not a physiological need. It's not an obligation. And then the last one is the damaged goods myth. And when you ask which one is the most damaging, I think it's that one, because it reaps so much shame for people who did feel like a pearl on their necklace was given away, or a petal on their rose. That's why there's roses on the cover of my book, to demonstrate like this, the idea that we were taught that you're a damaged and wilting rose if you go too far, or if you have premarital sex, or even if you're sexually abused. So that is the myth that I find to be the most damaging long term.
I think I'm thinking about the women that were raised in purity culture. I was raised in purity culture. When we first got married, it was a couple of years after we were married that I would wake up having dreams that I was being shamed for having sex. We went through counseling and worked through that, but that was like a really very real reality. Like you said, you court, you don't date, you wait until marriage, you don't give your pearls away, or you don't give your petals away. And a lot of women find that difficult to move from complete abstinence to healthy sexuality in marriage. And they may not even have an example in their home of what that could look like. So they're trying to figure it all out as they're walking into their new relationship with their
Mhm.
spouse. What
Mhm.
advice would you give women who maybe still carry some of those scars from purity culture into their marriage?
Mhm. I think what you're saying is true, Tara, that for men and women, it can be hard to flip the switch and to see
Absolutely.
sexuality as something that's good once you're married, but definitely for women because sexuality is emphasized less for us and it's more for the man. You know, sex is for him and his pleasure and his needs. So I think the flip switch myth is probably emphasized more to men, like this reward of great sex in marriage, than to women. And so I conceptualize purity culture as a form of trauma for some people. What I mean by that is it can create a trauma response in your body to the idea of sex or to being sexually intimate in your marriage, even. And the myths of purity culture can't just be turned off like a switch once you get married because those teachings really become embedded in your body. And so my clients will find themselves, you know, as you shared, like still reacting, having this bodily, physical cringe kind of reaction to sex, or the shame, the emotional reaction to sex, even in a healthy and loving and safe marriage, years after they're married, because they've been told their sexuality is really bad or denied. When you've suppressed it and denied it for so long, it's impossible to just turn that switch, flip that switch.
Yeah.
So what advice do I give? It's really a process of embracing your sexuality and recognizing it as a gift from God. It doesn't have to look or feel the exact same way as your husband's, but it's still something that you can embody. I think embodiment is really big with purity culture recovery because it creates such a divorce and a disembodiment from our mind and our body. You know, our mind is very emphasized, but our body not so much. And
Yeah.
so getting in touch with your body and seeing that as a good thing, and that's very hard when there's so much body shame in our culture. Yeah, so it really is a process for women to practice that embodiment and to practice affirming and owning their sexuality in a way that you still steward it in a way that honors God, but in a way that also feels like you have agency over it too.
That's good. Yeah, that's good.
Mutuality Matters podcast, along with thousands of CBE's other resources and content, is available for free on CBE's website, which is possible because of donor support. Together, we can spread the message that God calls women and men of all cultures, races, and classes to share authority equally in service and leadership in the home, church, and world. Give today at cbe.today/donate.
So let's talk about men for a second, because I think a lot of times when we talk about the effects of purity culture, we naturally go to, because I think some of the most explicit and obvious impacts are how it's affected women, even just what you guys have just been talking about. But there's been a dramatic impact on how men view sexuality who have been raised within purity culture. Can you talk a little bit about that impact on male sexuality and what it means to move into a healthier sexual ethic as a man in a marriage relationship?
Mm-hmm. I quote Zachary Wagner in the book, the author of Non-Toxic Masculinity, and he says purity culture dehumanized women's bodies. It dehumanized men's minds. You know, men's minds were seen as just debased and uncontrollable. Their sexual appetite and lust, you know, and just this, you know, animal that's you can't control, and it's every man's battle. But moving into a healthy view of male sexuality, I think involves like how can sex be mutual? It's not self-serving. It's not a give and take. It's a self-sharing experience of both partners sharing themselves in the relationship. And for men, often sexual entitlement is baked into purity culture and, you know, complementarian teachings of just like you're entitled to sex, you're entitled to her body. This is your reward for waiting. And instead, viewing sex as this mutual sharing, it takes away some of that entitlement and some of that inequality that I feel like purity culture instills in us. So that's one thing I try to help men with, but also to expand their definition of intimacy. So many men have equated intimacy with intercourse. You know, it's just that's the only way I know how to feel loved or connected with my wife is through intercourse, through sex. And there are so many other aspects of intimacy, like anything that makes you feel close and connected to your spouse is how I define intimacy. So could that be emotional intimacy and building that? Could it be intellectual, social, spiritual intimacy, like, or other forms of physical intimacy that aren't just intercourse or sex? Like, so really expanding that definition and growing in maturity in their ability to give and receive love. That's part of what a lot of the men have to work on, to start to heal and have a healthier sexual ethic in their marriage.
Mm. Yeah, that's so good. That's so true. And I think, I think a lot of it can be rooted in both shame and trauma, right? Like a lot of that intertwines together. And you talk a little bit about that. And, especially with restrictive gender roles,
Mm-hmm.
how, like, what steps can people take to kind of disentangle themselves from kind of harmful patterns that come from both trauma and shame kind of intertwining together when it comes to this conversation?
Yeah, when it comes to the restricted gender roles, I think that's just these gender stereotypes. All men are sexual and are going to want more sex. All women are not sexual and don't like or enjoy sex, or
Yeah.
things like that that can lead to shame for people who don't fit those stereotypes, or for people who do and find their marriage to be frustrating and unfulfilling. So you were asking, how can we start to
Just
um
disentangle some of those harmful patterns,
yeah. I think recognizing it is always the first step, developing some awareness and recognition of how this has affected you, and that you're a unique person that doesn't have to live up to stereotypes.
Mm.
Discovering what is true for you and your spouse, and finding what works for you in your marriage. Like, you don't have to follow some rule book that says you have to have sex every 72 hours, one of the kind of purity culture teachings.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but you can find what works for you and do that in a way that honors each other and honors God.
Yeah, that's so good. And I think I mean, I feel like some of the more helpful and healing conversations that we've had about our relationship and how it works for us has come through even some like when we were church planting, I was told that we had to have sex at least once a week or else my husband would cheat on me because of the pressures of the pastorate,
That, that
so
was that was actually a part of the vetting
it was a
process.
part of the vetting process to make sure that it was happening. And so like
That's
and it's not
awful.
that I know, and it's not that we don't want to have sex once a week. It's just that that's a pressure and a stipulation that removes the joy from it. It becomes an
Mm.
obligation. And I think having those conversations have helped us kind of understand and kind of even untangle maybe the healthy or the unhealthy patterns that were being or expectations that were being put on us too,
Mm.
of what
Hmm.
it looks like to have healthy sexual interaction as a couple. And so I think what you're saying is just so important.
Yeah, and I think it also I think the going back to what you were saying about like men and broadening our understanding of intimacy is
Hmm.
massive
Yeah.
because when physical sexuality is a part of a broader definition, a broader
Hmm.
foundation in a relationship of intimacy, it frees us from
Hmm.
conversations of frequency and things of that
Mm.
sort
Hmm.
that when we're talking about quantity and not quality
Hmm.
Yes.
are
Hmm.
largely unhelpful, and
Hmm.
also ignore the rhythms of life, that
Right.
there are
Hmm.
seasons of tremendous stress, there are
Hmm.
seasons of health issues, and
Hmm.
there are times in which if we're just focusing on physical sexuality alone and not a broader intimacy conversation, it can lead to externally imposed unmet expectations
Yeah.
that are unhelpful.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And just put unnecessary pressure on the couple too. Like, I think about some of the Christian sex books have talked about like the postpartum period, and when you're physically not recommended to have sex, that women need to do other things like
Hmm.
oral sex or things like that for their husband. And I just think what tremendous pressure that is when you are a brand new parent with a
Yeah.
newborn baby and you're healing, and just the love and the connection and the intimacy that my husband and I had in our postpartum periods through caring for our children together, and him caring for me and participating in my healing, and how much more intimate that is than just an obligation sex act.
Right.
It's so much more intimate and connecting to care for each other in those other ways.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot of this conversation, as you said, around purity culture, it involves this subject of shame, in both mind and body.
CBE International presents Women in Scripture and Mission. As a childless but faithful elderly woman, God blessed Elizabeth with her son, John the Baptist. During her pregnancy, Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. With the prophetic word, she identified Mary as the mother of her Lord. This is extraordinary when we remember that the disciples struggled to recognize Jesus, even with signs and wonders. Learn more at ministrywomen.org. That's ministrywomen.org.
What if, as a psychologist, what have you found to be some of the most effective techniques in therapy to help people heal from the effects of shame-based sexuality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I call shame the universal experience of purity culture because it really affects every person who grew up in purity culture, whether male or female, single or married, whether you waited until marriage or not. Like there's just shame embedded into it. So again, the first step is recognition and awareness of what shame is and what that looks like for you. That could be body shame and inhibitions. That could be shame about not living up to certain expectations for yourself or for your marriage. That could be shame about your sexuality, feeling like it's flawed and dirty and broken in general. I work with a lot of couples where, especially for women, they still view sex as dirty in their marriage. So recognizing that and being able to challenge those beliefs. So there's several exercises in the book that help you identify the false beliefs and teachings and then to deconstruct them, to challenge them, to find what is the evidence for this belief? Like, is there any? And what's the evidence that goes against this belief? And then coming up with your new truth that you're now going to live out. And when I say live out, it has to be lived out in an embodied experience for it to really be true. Again, it's not enough to just change your mind to make a cognitive shift from, for example, like sex is bad and dirty to, sex is good and for me in my marriage. It's not enough to just make that cognitive shift. You also have to have an embodied experience of the new belief. So once I've helped people figure out what their new beliefs are, what they want to carry forward with them, what new beliefs they want to carry with them, then it's how are you going to live that out in your body? And how are you going to have an embodied experience of that belief? So that might look like sex, being for you and really embodying that, or the ability to say no when you thought your previous belief was you were never allowed to say no, or that intimacy is more than just sex and living that out by really noticing and taking in those experiences of non-sexual intimacy. Yeah, so it's the embodied experience that truly makes the mind-body change in purity culture.
So good.
That's so good.
So obviously the majority of our time together, and unfortunately we only have a few more moments left, but I wanted to touch on the how purity culture impacts the church outside of the home. So looking at things like, obviously, most notably when we think about kind of purity culture and women in ministry and stuff, we think of things like the Billy Graham rule and all of that. But how has purity culture negatively impacted the way that both genders lead together in mutuality, both in society and the church? And what can we do to do better?
Well, I think purity culture is embedded and rooted in patriarchy. And so that I see is really the root problem, and how that affects leading together in church and home and culture is fighting against patriarchy, and all the expressions of that. So yeah, what can we do better? I mean, I think obviously embracing egalitarianism and living that out, and fighting against these misguided teachings, and really seeing what are the implications of these teachings, like the Billy Graham rule. On the surface, may appear safe to some people, may appear like this is a good and safe thing, but really look at the long-term ramifications and implications of that and how that's going to negatively impact women and men. How that sets us up to view each other as enemies and rather than co-laborers and partners in this work. So I think when we recognize the negative effects and we recognize how untrue these beliefs are, again, we can start to replace it with truth and live that out. But it's going to take like a lot of collective and systemic change for that. The book is really focused on the individual and personal experience of healing because that's the work I do as a psychologist. But I recognize like there needs to be systemic and broader macro changes too, or else we're just gonna, keep perpetuating these same problems and keep needing the individual healing decades later. So, yeah, so I hope that all of us, in the church working together and pastors especially can take the lead in providing some of the systemic changes that we need.
Yeah, it's so good.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Well, that's all the time that we have together. But Dr. Camden Morgante, thank you so much for joining us on the Mutuality Matters podcast. I want to encourage our listeners to pick up a copy of Recovering from Purity Culture. It's available wherever books are sold. And where can people follow your work?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And talking with you, and thank you for the work that you guys are doing. You can find me at my website, drcamden.com, or all the social medias at Dr. Camden. And yeah, the books were available wherever books are sold. So I hope it brings a lot of healing and freedom to people.
Awesome. Well, and thank you for joining us today on the Mutuality Matters podcast. Until next time, I'm Todd Korpi.
And I'm Tara Korpi.
And we'll see you soon.